For decades, the issue of slavery reparations has remained one of the most controversial and emotional debates between the Caribbean and former colonial powers. But now, that debate may be entering a completely new phase. Former Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Ralph Gonsalves, says slavery reparations must become a top issue at the next Commonwealth summit. And according to him, the Caribbean is no longer willing to stay silent. The Commonwealth, an international organization made up largely of former British colonies, has long avoided fully confronting the legacy of slavery and colonialism. But Caribbean leaders are now increasing pressure on the United Kingdom to address what many describe as one of the greatest injustices in human history. For more than 300 years, millions of Africans were captured, transported across the Atlantic, and forced into brutal slavery throughout the Caribbean and the Americas. Entire economies were built on enslaved labor. Sugar plantations in Jamaica, Barbados, and other colonies generated enormous wealth for Britain and Europe. Banks were built, ports expanded, industries grew rich, but that wealth came at a devastating human cost. Generations of enslaved Africans endured violence, forced labor, family separation, and systematic oppression. And many Caribbean leaders argue that the economic damage caused by slavery did not disappear after emancipation. Instead, they say its effects still shape poverty, inequality, debt, and underdevelopment across the region today. Now, reparations advocates believe the time has come for Britain to formally address that legacy. According to recent reports, Ralph Gonsalves stated that it would be inconceivable for reparations not to be front and center at the upcoming Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And this movement is not just coming from one country. CARICOM, the Caribbean community, has spent years pushing for reparatory justice through its Reparations Commission. The organization argues that former colonial powers should participate in programs aimed at repairing the long-term damage caused by slavery. That does not necessarily mean direct cash payments to individuals. Instead, Caribbean governments have proposed several forms of reparatory action, including investment in education, healthcare, infrastructure, cultural restoration, and economic development. Some leaders are also calling for formal apologies and debt relief. The issue gained even more international attention during recent Commonwealth discussions, where Caribbean nations reportedly pushed to place reparations on the official agenda. But the British government has continued to reject the idea of financial reparations. The United Kingdom has acknowledged the horrors of slavery historically, but officials have repeatedly stated that the government does not plan to make reparations payments. At the same time, pressure continues to grow internationally. African nations, activists, historians, and scholars are increasingly joining Caribbean voices in demanding deeper accountability from former colonial empires. Even King Charles III has publicly acknowledged the painful legacy of slavery, though symbolic recognition is very different from actual reparatory policy. And that difference is exactly where the debate becomes explosive. Supporters of reparations argue that slavery was not simply a tragedy of the past. They believe it created systems of inequality that still benefit wealthy nations today, while former colonies continue facing economic disadvantages. Critics, however, argue that modern governments should not be held financially responsible for actions committed centuries ago. Others question how reparations would even be calculated. Who would pay? Who would receive compensation? And what would true justice actually look like after hundreds of years? Those questions remain deeply divisive, but one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The reparations debate is no longer a fringe issue. It is now entering mainstream international politics. And at future Commonwealth summits, the Caribbean may force Britain and other former colonial powers into conversations they have long tried to avoid. For countries like Jamaica and many across the Caribbean, this issue is not only about history, it is about the present and possibly the future. Because the fight over reparations is really a larger fight over memory, justice, power, and the lasting consequences of empire. And that conversation is only getting louder, Please like, share, and subscribe for more from the Caribbean Chronicles TV.